Oh my
Hi.
gosh, it's
Hey.
me. Hey man, how are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Oh, I'm here in Philadelphia. It's been on the news a lot recently. Things out here are pretty exciting, as you can imagine. Lots of stuff going on in the US these days, but yeah, I'm doing great. Getting a lot of work done, and here we are.
It's
So you're
true.
still you're still in
Sorry.
Japan, right? You're still
Yeah,
working in Japan?
I'm still working in Japan. This is well until the end of the month, and then I'm flying back to Spain.
Okay,
So
wow.
when I'll be in Spain, I'm gonna talk with Andres. The
Oh,
interview
perfect.
with Andres is the Spanish translator for the people who are watching us. Is the Spanish translator of his Your First Book, which
Yeah. So
is
So this
yeah,
is the
that's
English, which came out about 2 years ago, and then the Spanish came out last month, or maybe even 2 weeks ago. It's amazing. This is our first, the publications company first book in Spanish, and I really hope that we're going to continue producing works in other languages other than English. There are too many circus books in French and English, and there are so many more circus performers and people that have a huge interest in circus and juggling and all of these topics that, we need to get the information out there. And so that's one of the main missions, I guess, of Modern Vaudeville Press, of the publication company.
yes. Well, I was a brief introduction of Modern Vaudeville Press. Is your booking publisher home? I think that's the word in English.
Yeah, so it's a publishing house is what we call it. So like you've got the major ones, like your Penguin and all these people that make textbooks, and you go to any bookstore and you can buy a book, and those are the massive companies, and we're a little company. So we're a similar model to a university press that generates academic things. Um, but yeah, it's all mission driven stuff. So like it's hard to make a living selling books, and I certainly don't make a living selling books. This is a passion project. This is a thing. We're basically trying to make sure that every title that we come out, it can pay for itself within 2 years in sales, and then long term potentially make some money so that we can make more ambitious projects down the line. Um, it was cool, but there are a lot of it's publishing. There are lots of costs involved with anything, but that's boring. We're here to talk about juggling, not about the book industry.
Well, actually, the idea was to first talk about juggling and then about the book
Yeah.
industry. But
Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about juggling. Let's do that.
okay, so if anyone doesn't know you yet, you are a professional juggler who has worked with Cirque du Soleil or many other companies. But we know Cirque du Soleil, everyone is like, oh, okay, it's Cirque du Soleil. So we have to mention that, like, oh, okay, okay.
Yeah. 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 And you came out in Spain in Madrid a couple of times to
Yeah,
hang out and see the show. Yeah.
2018 was? I don't remember. It was 18 or 17. It's 18.
Yeah, we were in Spain for about 10 months, and I think we were in Madrid at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was thinking it was because it was near my birthday also. Because I remember I
Yeah.
went, you invite me to Totem at my birthday or very
Yeah.
closely. So it was around 3 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. There
Uh,
we are. But yeah, so
so,
I was with Cirque du Soleil for about 5 years. I worked for them from 2014 to 2019 on the show Totem.
mhm.
Um, yeah, which I guess if we have a lot of people watching in Spain, maybe a bunch of people saw it. Now, these days, what's his name? Miguel Gigosos Rondo is the juggler that's on the show. Of course, Soleil isn't doing any shows anymore, or like right now. Um, but yeah, no. So I worked for Soleil for about 5 years. Before that, I've done a bunch of stuff with the IJA. I've done a bunch of circus festivals and juggling festivals all around the world. It's just really wonderful. The juggling community it's my family, and so that's why I do everything that I do.
Yeah, so I was wanting to ask because, well, you attend college, you did a degree in Germanic languages, is that right?
Yeah, so I went to university twice, right? So you have your undergraduate and then your graduate degree.
Mhm.
So I went to school. My official degree is in German languages and literatures. That's undergrad, so you graduate when you're like 21 or so it's college. But I also studied Spanish and Portuguese and Arabic and a couple of other, like, just general communications, language, linguistics interest. And then eventually I went to graduate school and I got a master's in arts administration, specifically nonprofit, like mission-driven arts organizations.
Which is the one you did with NECA?
No, NECA was that's a totally different program. NECA is
Okay. Sorry.
it's a school in southern Vermont. It's a small circus school. In a lot of ways, it's similar to like Carampa. It's small. They've got a wonderful coaching staff, but you really have to push yourself to grow. It's not quite the same as going to DOC or ECQ in Montreal or something, or ENC rather. Yeah, so NECA was it was like a 10-month program that I was in, and so there were trapeze people and silks and rope and some tumblers, and I was one of 2 jugglers in that program. And in a lot of ways, that was my first exposure to circus as more than just juggling. Like I grew up in definitely like the juggling community, the variety burlesque show kind of community when I was first starting out. But NECA was yeah, that's basically where I managed to get in acrobat shape. I certainly lost that very quickly. But, I did my first cartwheel when I was 24. Thank you, NECA, for allowing me to do that. But yeah, so I trained there for a while, and then I went off with Soleil. I came back to Brattleboro. Anyway, now I'm in Philadelphia, and all last year after I finished with Soleil, after I left the company, I've been working on cruise ships mostly.
Mm-hmm.
And so presenting my own hour-long show on cruise ships, so twice a week, in one night on a ship. But since the pandemic, my entire calendar evaporated, everybody's calendar, except for you. How did you get so lucky? Why are you working right now, man?
Yeah. Japan is still working a little bit. I don't know. Also because I'm in a theme park. So I don't have to get hired, like I have a full contract for the whole year. They just keep the contract going. And we perform whenever there is or there isn't any audience. So
that's amazing. That's got to be such a weird experience.
Yeah, it's a really good year to have this contract. It was really on time.
That's beautiful.
So I wanted to ask because when did you decide to go as a professional juggler? Because when you went to college, you were planning to do a professional career out of that degree? Or?
Yeah, that was the original idea. I've always been very interested in translation and interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I mean, if we rewind just a little bit, like I wrote the English. I would not, like, my Spanish is good enough to read this, but
not to write it.
I could not necessarily write an academic book in Spanish. Maybe like 15 years ago when I was still in school, but not so much. So I am still interested very much in, in words and language and conveying ideas and thinking, trying to find these weird stories through research and using language that way. But yeah, when I graduated from Washington University, undergrad, the German degree, I discovered it was very hard to get a job with a degree in German literature. And that was also in the middle of the Great Recession in the US. That was back in 2009. So there already, there weren't very many jobs to begin with. And up until that point, juggling had always been a really lovely hobby for me, just, a pastime. And yeah, when I graduated college, I realized that juggling was my only marketable skill. If I wanted to eat, if I wanted to pay rent, I would absolutely need to start juggling a little bit more seriously. And so I was living in Colorado then, and eventually I got signed on to a circus sideshow tour. I don't know that sideshow is such a big thing in Spain, but sword swallowers and people sticking needles through their body. And
I've always kind of mixed cabaret, vaudeville, and sideshow. I don't know if they are similar or it's just because in Spain we don't have that. We just have, there are not even, I think, there are not, people might kill me because saying that.
Yeah.
But I don't see a lot of big cabarets nowadays. So when you see a cabaret, it's a cabaret, vaudeville, everything is together.
Yeah. Yeah, in the U.S., Sideshow came out of the tent show tradition, specifically with Barnum. Like that was the major thing. You know, he had this massive tented show with however many rings, and he had a sideshow manager. This is around the time when it was still very like highbrow, noble to, if a British royalty would invite a midget to their dinner party for entertainment. Like it
Mhm.
wasn't considered like it was culturally appropriate. Lots of air quotes there. You know, it was a common thing. And from it came to the U.S. and it combined with menagerie. So, where you have giraffes and elephants and all of these amazing animals that you couldn't see otherwise, because this is like the
Mhm.
1840s, 1850s. And in the fullness of time, the circus eventually decided that they liked having the midway and the sideshow there. So it's a slightly different format than what you see in Europe, at least today when we talk about circuses. So there would be a smaller tent on the outside that would have the like disgusting or sexy or like non-Christian acts, I think is one way that some people would word it. So, if you have like the circus, everybody comes, they watch the acrobats, it's fun for the whole family. But perhaps the father, I think a lot of this is coming from like a patriarchal culture and a lot of other stuff. But there was always like a show with like a lady in like a little bikini and the bearded woman and kangaroos boxing each other, that kind of thing. So like more of I guess the vulgar spectacle, like the lowbrow spectacle.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
and at least in the U.S., vaudeville was almost a reaction against that in some ways. And so those were all very polite shows. Like there would never be swearing, there would never be nudity.
Ah,
That's why you always think of vaudeville and you think somebody in like a top hat and a nice suit. By and large. And of course, when we look at the vaudeville market across the U.S., like there are the fancy theaters and there are the not quite so nice theaters. You want to go see a show in Paris, you can go to Lido, you can go to Moulin Rouge, or you can probably go to somebody's basement and see something weird too. It's humanity, it's people. It's all the same.
uh, I think I heard in an interview that you started doing a street shows.
I have done some street shows. I started actually, yeah. The first shows I ever did were street shows in Colorado, and they were really bad. Yeah, I had done some stage like little cabaret shows or like little juggling festival shows, where everybody's sitting and they're very excited about the juggling. And then yeah, trying to do that on the street as just a kid straight out of college, I had no clue what I was doing. The very first show I ever did. There were like 20 people in the audience, maybe. They were all just being very polite. They didn't, they didn't want to make me look bad by walking away or something. But I ended up giving all of the money back. I gave all of the money back to everybody that paid me. I was like, this was so embarrassing. Just forget it ever happened. I don't want I need it, but I gotta earn it. It was terrible. Yeah.
Yep, and then because also at the beginning, I think you were more of a contemporary juggler. Like,
Yeah,
you
contemporary
have,
ball juggling. Yeah.
yeah, you have uploaded the video you were sending to Quebec, I think, the Quebec
Oh
people,
yeah.
and it
Yeah.
was very contemporary. It wasn't vaudeville, I think. It
No,
was.
no, definitely not. So when I first started, I was really interested in like 3 and 4 ball juggling, and I still do enjoy it. Like I think it's so interesting and so fascinating. There's so many beautiful
Well,
things you can do with
you
movement.
did a workshop in the last TJC about
Yeah,
ball juggling, which was fantastic. And then
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of
Thank you.
new moves and different body catches and all that kind of contemporary style. That was really, really cool.
Yeah, it's super fun, and that's I researched that. I guess if we want to use the research word, I played with that. I enjoyed that. That was a huge part of my style. And like in my cruise ship show, I still do like there is a section of ball juggling that a juggler could watch, and I think they would enjoy it. It's some of the weird stuff. It's not just 5 balls and a gattoplex and throw one tall and catch it. Um, but yeah, no, I started doing more things with, I guess we'd call it found objects. Sort of gentleman juggler style. In the vein of Cara and Salerno and people. And that was, I had a contract at it was a scrap metal recycling event. It sounds so boring, and it is so boring. It was a convention center in St. Louis, so like right in the middle of the U.S., right, the red belly of the U.S. And it was some big event where all of the people that owned the factories that melt aluminum cans and old, broken down cars and things, and they were, I thought it was going to be just nothing, but it was the biggest money event I've been to, like I'd say almost ever. And I did a premiere at Royal Albert Hall. This thing was somehow still bigger. Like they had a life-size statue of one of those, those Wild West covered wagons, like the stagecoaches, made entirely out of ice, a giant ice sculpture, life-size, human, like huge. And around the bottom of it, was all these like shrimps and like a raw oyster bar. And then you could eat alligator on one side. And then they had sandwiches and steak on the, like totally crazy, massive room. And I was there juggling, I was wearing like a little saloon keeper outfit. I had a little bolo and a little mustache drawn on, wearing a little apron. And I had to go out and do 3 sets. It's ambient, atmosphere, animation, whatever we want to call it. And the first 30 minutes I did ball juggling stuff and nobody even looked at me. And, these are like, the white collar, they're all millionaire. Like it's like high society or whatever. And it's like, oh, well, circus is art. It's clearly it's art. Everybody wants to watch juggling and nobody watched me at all. And I was so upset. So the second time I went out, I just found, like in the recycling bin or whatever, just an empty bottle of champagne. And I put the champagne bottle on my head and I just walked. I just did laps, and I did that for 30 minutes. And I could see that, there were people like in their little groups looking over and sort of pointing. It's like, okay, yeah, okay. So people see the bottle, they see it's in danger. There's something interesting there. And then for the third set, I just got 3 plates from like the caterers or whoever was working at the event. And I just did the 3-plate slide, just walking around and almost dropping one. And at that point, people were coming around and they were watching, and it was like, oh my God, like this is, just taking it as one data point, one little anecdote. It was so interesting to see that the ball juggling I was doing was so technically difficult or advanced or whatever word we want to use. It's ball juggling for jugglers. Mm-hmm. But then when you do something really simple with an object that sort of tells the story, will it break? Will it drop? I've held a plate. I know how heavy they are. Seeing the reaction there really informed a lot of my later work, especially that, the more commercial stuff, like on cruise ships, you can't get away with being a contemporary circus artist. You're there to provide an entertaining experience in whatever format that is. And if you don't do it, you won't get hired again. So, you have to really think more in those narrative frameworks, which is slightly different, I think, than the way that a lot of contemporary circus schools teach now. It's more of like a theatrical way instead of dance, Martha Graham.
We have also talked about it sometimes, but I think it's also a difference between a 5 minutes act or a solo act of an hour. I mean, you could do, if you are in a big show, you could do 3 minutes of very contemporary juggling and it will be really cool, and you may not need any storytelling, nothing more than the aesthetic. But if you are doing a 1 hour show or 40 minutes or anything, you have to grab their attention.
Yeah, like one of the ways that I kind of think about it, or at least when I talk to students at the circuit school here, is I think of technique as like a flourless chocolate torte. Like those beautiful chocolates that like it's just you just need that much and your whole mouth just explodes with chocolate, right? It's so rich and so heavy and delicious and wonderful. And you want to eat the whole thing, but you're just gonna vomit. Like it's just way too much. It's too rich. It's incredible, And so when you think about like, like a 5-minute experience, like you can get away with giving someone like a little bonbon it's just the most potent, perfect, beautiful flavor, right? If we just think about that's what the contemporary artist is doing with 5 minutes of just pure distilled technique. But then when we start thinking about, like a 45-minute, a long format show, an hour-long show, like, if you went to a fancy restaurant and you sat down at the big table, this is an event, you went there, you sat in the seat, you've been thinking about it, and you just get all the chocolate you can eat for an hour, you're going to be pretty sick of it pretty soon, right? Like you need the variety. And so, if we just to really extend the metaphor and make it completely alienating to everybody, like when you sit down at a nice restaurant, like, there's this wonderful warm bread, and if you just had the bread, you would be so pissed off. But it's like it's warm, and there's this beautiful butter, and it's like it's nothing. But like, how can you're walking on stage and saying hello and introducing yourself to the audience be that sort of like predictable? Like, oh my God, the bread was good. I am so excited for the rest of the meal, And then you've got all the different things, and then the big crescendo at the end, of course, is the flourless chocolate cake. That's the only reason you went there in the first place.
I love that metaphor. I really like it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, a meal isn't narrative, but juggling or circus or shows don't always have to be narrative. So it's just, like, what ingredients are there? How do they interact with one another to make the whole thing feel complete and satisfying? Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to ask you because you do gentleman juggler style. Would
Yeah.
you say but it's not like it's. I heard you talk about reverse engineering, which
Yeah.
I love that word. But it's
Okay.
like you do gentleman juggling tricks, very based in historical things, whether there is another way, like people who do cigar boxes or
Mhm.
hat juggling, or there are many things that are more normal, more classical, like you could throw clubs or you could throw hats.
Yeah.
They're more similar. And you
Yeah.
have never done that kind of stuff?
No, I'm much more interested in the weird stuff, like the things that aren't being performed anymore or haven't been performed in a long time. Because so throughout like the research process, I'm working on a whole bunch of different books. I never tell people I'm not a circus historian, a juggling historian. I'm a circus researcher. I'm a juggling researcher, or historiographer is a word that nobody uses in English that I think is much better descriptor. But yeah, no. So like, if you wanted to see somebody kick a hat onto a cane that they're balancing on their forehead, like the classic stuff, like we're talking about Booba, we're talking about all of those big names. Like, just saying that, you nodded in agreement, like, oh, it's like, I know that trick, I've seen that trick, maybe I've played with that trick or thought about doing that trick. It's like that is the trick that exists in the community already. It doesn't need protecting, it doesn't need saving. There is somebody who is keeping it alive. But the more that you read, the more you start to discover that there are entire artistic disciplines within juggling and within vaudeville and within circus that are disappearing just because they didn't pass it down to somebody, they didn't teach somebody how to do it. But they're really remarkable and interesting and important things within our collective past as circus performers. And if I guess contemporary circus schools today, like the whole idea of the school is to bring in new and interesting circus into tomorrow. But a lot of these schools, especially within the juggling community, and this isn't like a call out at anybody, it just happened that nobody wrote this stuff down, and we've got more people today that are finding it more and more important to document this stuff. David Kane and Eric Albury and, Jack Calvin, like all Niels Dunker, all of those guys. But yeah, so like if these schools want to make sure that they're able, like the future of circus is going to exist, they should really be teaching the past of circus a lot better, I think, or at least they need to start acknowledging that it's really difficult to decide where an artistic discipline needs to go. It's really difficult, like as a performer, to see if you have, is this a new idea or not? Am I reinventing the wheel? Did somebody come up to this far and then, then they died or retired, or they decided they wanted to do something else and just nobody bothered to continue that work? Like how can we make sure that we've got the most interesting and vibrant future in circus as we possibly can? And I think, yeah, to want to change the future, you really need to understand the past. Like you need to understand what circus has been in order to decide where circus should go.
There's also your way to try to recover or investigate the juggling. It looks kind of similar for me to magic. I know you don't do magic, but you have a way, like the Maximum Entertainment book, the one with Max Weber that you recommend me, and it's for magicians, but you use it, and it could be used also for juggling and all that kind of stuff. So you have a very similar way of thinking than than many magicians, because some magicians are a lot like you have to documentate everything and know who was the
Yeah.
first to do it and the different versions and all that kind of.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, if we look at that trend, though, magicians tend to think in this way. But then you look at the body of historical information. The library the magicians have it's got to be 30, 40 times bigger than the rest of circus as a whole. And we're talking about, not necessarily not fan books. Like there's so many like traditional circus fan books, like A Day at the Circus picture book. Circus exists; it's this cultural institution. But magicians, if you wanted to learn how to use like an invisible reel, just like a thread reel that's like the little bit of wax and whatever, like you could pick up any number of books in any number of languages that tell you the basics of like invisible thread magic. But if you wanted to find out something that's more complicated than a three-ball cascade and juggling, there really aren't a lot of written books. Like there's Charlie Dancy's work, there's Dave Finnegan's work, and then there are a couple of like older, more esoteric things that are sort of floating out there. But that was one of the main reasons why I started working on this how-to book that came out this past summer, is because there hadn't been a major book that talked about an updated book about juggling techniques since I guess Dave Finnegan's book came out, or Juggling from the Complete or for the Complete Klutz. There was nothing that talked about side swap, and that's been the primary way the jugglers talk to each other for over 20 years. Like that's crazy. Like that's like willfully not writing about juggling as a community in a way. I mean that sounds like a condemnation. Like that's not really what I mean, but it's just funny to see how the magicians have been so interested in their own history and their own inner workings and the life of past magicians, whereas in the juggling world we like throwing stuff. And that's sort of like, again, that's a very reduced version of the reality, but speaking broadly, I think that's true.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, and then I think we can start talking about modern vaudeville press, but about you. When did you start to be interested in history? Like, we know when did you start to be interested in gentleman juggling, like in use normal objects? Mm-hmm. But it went it together, or how did you?
Yeah, so I learned how to juggle three balls when I was in middle school. I was living in New Orleans at the time, like way down in the South. And there was a student from Trinidad and Tobago in the class. He was like an exchange student, or his parents were working in town, something I don't really know. But he knew how to juggle three rocks, and he could get like 10, 12 catches, and he tried teaching me in the tennis court, like when I was super young out in the park or whatever. And I was a terrible student. I was a terrible study. It took me maybe 3 weeks to learn how to juggle three rocks, And like by the time I was finished, I was like, okay, check, done. Juggling is finished. What else? What else is next on the horizon for me to conquer? And a couple of years later, I had this English teacher, like your language arts teacher or whatever. I think it was like 5th or 6th grade. And I had to write a book report on a nonfiction book. And I was so upset about it. I was so pissed off. So I went to the school library, and they had a copy of The Complete Juggler by Dave Finnegan that was on a shelf about games or something. And it was in the nonfiction section. And so I decided to write my report about that instead of about like, the American Civil War or whatever I was supposed to do. And yeah, but like opening that book, you suddenly realize that there's so much more than just a three ball cascade or whatever, throwing one high that you invented. The tricks that everybody invents when they first start. Yeah, and then eventually my family moved to St. Louis, and so that's St. Louis, Missouri, right in the center of the country. And there was a juggling club that met about 2 miles away from my home, or where my parents had moved. I was in high school at that point. But that was the same juggling club where Tony Pezzo, like very young Tony Pezzo, 5 years old, 6 years old. Like we basically grew up together, right? Tony Pezzo and Kellen Quinn and Cameron Ritter, Richard Kennison was coaching all of them. It was like a hotbed of jugglers. Like it was such a vibrant club. And yeah, so I started going there every single week for years. And then eventually I went to college and we started a club there, and there we are. So I guess juggling has always been part of my life somehow since I was 10 years old. More than 2/3 of my life I've been a juggler.
But when did you start to be interested in the history of
Oh, sorry, sorry,
the
sorry. The history, yeah. There was this book called Strange Feats and Clever Turns by a guy named Charlie Holland. I think Oddball still sells it. It's kind of hard to find these days, but it's so my parents got it for me for a Christmas present. It was like, oh, this kid likes juggling. We're gonna get him a juggling book. So maybe he'll actually read the book if it's a book about juggling. And so this book is all about old, like Victorian age, like variety performance, juggling, music hall, vaudeville, that kind of thing. And it's all newspaper clippings. So like the original newspaper clippings from you know, periodicals or whatever in the 1870s. And there's one about Paul Cinquevalli, of course. There's a chapter about him, but there are also things about strongmen, you know, that are like, they put people into barrels. Like Eugene Sandow used to put two people in barrels and then press them over his head with one arm, like insane, right? And barrel jumpers. Did you know that barrel jumping was a huge artistic discipline in the US and Europe in the 1800s? Like, you know, those big just wooden barrels that you see on the street, or, you know, they're full of grain or something, but it's jumping straight up and landing in one. And then while you're inside of the barrel, being able to jump up high enough to jump back out of it. So imagine that, like you can't really bend your knees and that kind of thing. And so there are these people that were like celebrated leapers and celebrated jumpers. And yeah, and so like I'd never heard of this stuff. I was 15, 16, whatever. And you know, so like that had always been I'd always had some part of that book inside of my brain ever since I read it. But then when I started really thinking about the history in a practical way, I did a contract. It was in South Korea. This was back in 2012. It was like a U.S. military tour. It's a USO tour. So like they bring in artists to entertain people on military bases. Whatever your politics are, it was a gig. And yes, there was a guy in that show who was doing a glass balancing act, but it wasn't with his teeth. It was I've never seen this before, and I don't think I'll ever see it again. But this guy was Victor Dodonov. If you're really into Rollabola, you know who this guy is. He does a 7-stack. It's insane. Like it's like that tall. Like this guy is amazing, and he dresses like a penguin when he does it. I don't understand it. But there was some act that was out, and they were like, crap, who has a backup act for this show? And Victor was like one of the people like on the marquee or whatever. And I was like, hey, I'll do it. And he produces this little sherry glass, just like a little glass for like, you know, small cognac or an aperitif or something. But the bottom of it has been sawed off, and it looks like a clothespin, you know, like it looks like just like a little spring, like little leather hoop or something. And he clipped it over his nose. And then he had 2 assistants with him that handed him glasses behind his back. And he built, like, as high as he can reach, these different platforms of these small glasses and lit candles. And like when I say a huge platform, like I'm talking about 30, 40 glasses total. Like it's massive. And at the end, there's somebody standing on a ladder who is placing the last ones on the balance. And, you know, he's there and it's just pressing into the bridge of his nose. And then he walks, you know, and then the payoff of the act or whatever is he has this massive glass apparatus just balanced on the bridge of his nose. And he walks all the way up the ladder, and then he walks all the way back down the ladder while keeping it in the balance. And so when I saw that was like, oh my God, I've never seen this before. But there's something about it, like I don't think a modern person would have come up with this act. Like 2012, I don't think that somebody who doesn't know something that I don't know would come up with that. And so I want to find out what they know that I don't. And so that's when I started looking more into like, you know, just stuff with plates and glasses and things that would break, because I really enjoyed that element, you know, that theatrical element, whether or not something's actually going to break. And yeah, so from there it just kind of snowballed, and here I am now. Yeah.
Yeah. So about modern vaudeville press.
Yeah.
If I know correctly, you first start writing the book, the Forgotten History of Juggling.
Yeah.
while you were working with Cirque du Soleil?
Yeah, when I was working with Soleil, yeah, I started getting bored. I just started getting really bored.
I didn't
And
want to. I heard that in an interview, but I didn't
yeah,
want to be the one who say it.
yeah, no, of course. And I mean, like that's such a loaded word, you know. Like I feel like it's that most people when they hear the word boredom, they hear it as just like this absolute like it's almost a depression, right? Like it's just this apathy. And I don't that's not the kind of board that I think I'm talking about really. Like so you've been on this contract for how long? The one in Japan. Like you've done hundreds of shows at this point. And imagine if you had somebody watching you that made sure that every single thing you did from one day to the next was exactly the same.
I
Like
kind
you
of.
walk in the same. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the reality of any kind of show business where you're kind of in the circus factory, right? And so, you know, there's a point where you're like, okay, I'm doing this job well. Like I've had however many shows in a row without a drop, and I need something to stimulate my brain because this show is no longer this big challenge that I'm trying to conquer. And yeah, and so somebody asked me about juggling in Egypt. You know, the ancient Egyptian jugglers of Beni Hassan, so famous. I'll flip through the book just for a visual reference because hey, we're here.
Yeah, because
Like we're talking about these women, yeah. And I knew just the basics. Like I'd read an article that was in Juggle magazine once, and that was it. And so I was like, okay, well, I've got plenty of time, and maybe I can write like a short essay that just sort of tells absolutely everything possible. And so it's helpful because my father is an Egyptologist. So he had access to a couple of books that I needed to try and find. Like I was still, you know, remembering how to research properly after finishing school so long ago. And yeah, so I started writing this Egyptian thing, and from there I started learning a whole bunch of things. I think I started the chapter about Turkey that's in there, or like that sort of Byzantine, Babylonian area, Israel, Babylon, Turkey, all of that area. Yeah, for some reason I started working on that because I read a thing that talked about these Egyptian and or Indian travelers around the year 1000 that did a performing tour and they had to cross all of Iraq and Iran on foot. And when they started the tour, there were like 120 people strong. By the time the tour finished a year and a half later, only 10 people had survived. You know, like, oh my God, how can you not try and follow up on a story like that? And so slowly, just, you know, with Egypt as the point of penetration, you slowly start to find evidence of juggling everywhere. And that's when this, you know, eventually turned into a full-on book project. Yeah, so I guess it happened organically, but it was all just from, you know, an initial spark of curiosity that was followed through. So.
There were, well, I don't know, there were any other history juggling book, like, so not about, because I know David Kane has many of them, but not about a concrete topic, but about history.
Not so much. I'm just going to grab it really quickly, but the book by Karl-Heinz Dieffen, so you're probably familiar with this massive book, right? So Carl is amazing. Karl-Heinz Dieffen, absolute legend. Like, holy cow, this dude, he's amazing. I don't know what you know about him. I think he's sort of later on in years. He's in his 70s or 80s, and he lives in Berlin. But my entire book, the ancient juggling section, is 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, it's about 10 pages long. Like, this is the ancient juggling that was addressed in this book, the definitive book about juggling history, depending on who you ask. It's certainly got a lot of info. But I found out, so that book came out halfway through my writing my antiquity book. This came out in, I think, late 2017 or mid 2017. And I made a promise to myself that I had already gotten so far along on my own original research that I wouldn't even read any of the ancient stuff that is talked about in Carl's. Because the way that Carl does a lot of his research, and he's amazing in the fact that he can do this, he's been a part of the juggling, like the deep inner circle of juggling for ages, for decades and decades. Like, his name is painted in a mural at the Tigerpalast, or is it or Tigerpalast or Crystal Palast? Either way, there's a famous German variety theater that has a mural about him in the green room, saying like, "Without juggling, there is no Wintergarten. Without Karl-Heinz Ethan, there is no juggling." Like, all praise Karl-Heinz Ethan, right? It's amazing. But so due to that nature, his relationship, every time there was a big name, like you've got Chris Cremo or Gatto or Ignatov or whoever coming through town, he would go and hang out with them. So he got all of these stories, just all of these anecdotes. You can't rely on anecdotes for, studying ancient history that died 2,000 years ago,